Great. So, hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Anurok Knowledge Exchange. Though with the erudite and almost scholarly guest that we have today, there may not be too much of an exchange. Hopefully, we all should benefit from some one-sided lessons on money and personal finance. I should introduce our guest formally, but only after I invite her to say hi to all. She's logged in already. So, friends, welcoming the most ardent advocate of a fair marketplace for financial services consumers and author of best-selling book Let's Talk Money. We have with us Monica Hallan. Hi, Monica. Long time. How are things?
Good. Thank you so much for the invite. Hope everybody is doing well.
Great. Welcome, Monica. And before we get into the discussion, I shall take a minute to introduce you formally, and you will have to modestly listen to that with a straight face. So, for the benefit of everyone else, on a serious note, friends, Monica Hallan is the author of the best-selling book Let's Talk Money and a consulting editor with Mint. She's an MA in economics from the Delhi School of Economics and a master's in journalism from University of Wales in Cardiff. She has worked across media organizations and has run 4 successful TV series. She was an advisor to the Swaroop Committee, a member on the Bose Committee, a member on the task force of the Financial Redressal Agency, and a member on the SEBI Mutual Fund Committee. So, guys, these are committees which shape regulations. So she's part of that. And if some of you got that, these are multiple products. The multiple committees. One was on mutual fund, one on insurance, one was on PF as well, if I remember right. She's the author of 2 academic papers. I think they're published in the Journal of Economic Policy and Comparative Economics. She's based in New Delhi and was a Yale World Fellow in 2011. That's, I think, the Maurice Greenberg World Fellowship. So with that done, let's put you out of your misery, Monica, and let's kick off our session straight away. So we have a sort of an eclectic mix of audience, largely representing sort of pretty smart real estate professionals, a bunch of BFSI sort of professional leaders from the Anurok group. I can see many leaders from the Anurok group already on the screen, and there's an open forum. It's been sort of screened live on Facebook as well. So the general audience is also coming in. So Monica, I'll kickstart off with getting your view on a topic that you and even I am quite passionate about, which is financial planning. So India is severely underpenetrated in terms of financial planning. Many people do not even know what a financial plan is, and every Indian household should have a documented financial plan. Clearly, this is not the case. So do you feel the same angst, and should we be doing more about this?
You've actually hit really at the core of the problem, which is why does India not have better markets for financial planning? And I think the answer actually lies not in the marketplace as it works. It would be wrong to chase individual companies or the frontline staff, but I think we've got to put the focus on regulators and policymakers, because the marketplace is a function of how policy sees the various arms of the market. And so we have regulators who've broken the market up according to function, according to the form of the product, which means that insurance, mutual funds, pensions, they're very similar products in many ways, but it's got broken into 3 regulators. And then you have a problem of entities who are not under the jurisdiction of either SEBI or IRDA in the banks selling products which are not under the jurisdiction of the RBI. So you have the marketplace itself is completely warped. And for many decades, as India went on the privatization road, the product structures have not facilitated financial planning. Right? So what do I mean when I say financial product structure? The incentive to the seller should be when the consumer has a good outcome, not in terms of return, but in terms of meeting his financial goals. The way that incentives are structured is that especially in products like insurance, it's a hit and run market. Now, SEBI has done extremely well, because you've got a product structure in the mutual fund which reduces hugely the scale of mis-selling. So we see financial planning happen far more in the space of mutual funds than insurance. Although the marketplace should remove these divisions, look at regulation by function, which means investment, insurance, which is risk management, pensions, fixed return, and then fixed regulatory roles and responsibilities. So we have a deeply flawed marketplace in which the buyer is being asked to beware. We want to move to a seller beware market. Suppose we were to move to a seller beware market where the person selling is responsible for suitable product sale. You see how fast financial planning grows. So I would put the blame squarely on policy and regulators.
Amazing, Monica. And for many real estate enthusiasts who are there on this audience, this is easy to learn from financial services because SEBI, IRDA, and AMFI to some extent, though it's not being the regulator, RERA is following about 20 years behind these regulators. So what is happening in BFSI will happen in real estate with some lag. And it's sort of important to learn lessons from that. So Monica, you're saying it's more a regulatory sort of a play which is led to this situation, and there's no solution, but obviously we have to keep on evangelizing the sort of importance of a multi-asset class financial plan till people understand it more and more, right?
Correct, absolutely. And also to the point of a real estate regulator, I think the problem is far more complex because it's a state subject. Every state will interpret it differently. You will have states which have done very well, and you've got states which not have even put up a proper, decent website. So I don't know how the intervention of RERA is going to work, because real estate is a state subject, whereas what you need is certain uniformity of industry standards across different states. So RERA, in my mind, is still deeply work in progress. There is a lot more which has to be done before people have a similar confidence in RERA that they possibly may have in an RBI or a SEBI.
Miles to go easily. But Monica, coming back to the point that we had started off with on financial plan and sort of sticking around that piece a bit, just to close a couple of more points there. You normally advocate a 3 to 6 months emergency fund. You've advocated that in a book as well as in many articles. Because of these COVID times, have we sort of come upon a newer need of setting up almost a force majeure emergency fund in addition to that, the earlier one, or was that enough?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because the publisher of my book, HarperCollins, actually has got me to do a chapter. And we are hoping that by Jan 21, we should be out with the new edition of Let's Talk Money, where, of course, there's an update. Plus, there's a chapter on how to deal with an event like a pandemic.
Wow.
And to tell you the truth, that I have reworked the emergency fund piece, because honestly, I don't think any financial planner, anybody, would have built in this deep shock to the system, to everyone. So I have actually said that between 6 months to 2 years, depending upon how risky you perceive your job to be. Now, if you're a government servant, you can be reasonably certain that your income will continue. But if you're, say, in the real estate sector, or in aviation, or in hotels, or in journalism, wherever you may be in sectors which are extremely high risk, the axe could simply fall on you. So depending on the situation of your earning and your age. Now, people in their 50s are very high risk, because by the time you're in your 50s, you're already at the peak of your earning career. You're a very expensive resource for the firm. To let you go, if you're not pulling your weight, if you're not adding value, would be an easy decision for the firm, because it's saving a chunk of money. In your 50s, it'll be very difficult to get a similar job. So I am saying that if you're in your 50s, you've already got your retirement kitty mostly in place. Keep 2 years of living expenses in a near use form, whether it's a debt fund, whether it's a fixed deposit, whatever makes you comfortable, but have that 2 years of living expenses ready at hand, because market cycles could take some time to recover. I mean, we've seen a very sharp stock recovery. But it needn't have been like that. You see, nobody can predict markets. When end of March, markets tanked 30%, who knew that they would bounce back like that, right? So it's prudent to have 2 years in near liquid out of the retirement corpus if you're in your 50s. So yes, I did rework my extreme emergency fund allocation because of COVID.
Amazing. And the extent of 2 years sort of surprises us, or doesn't surprise us, but sort of puts us back to think a bit. And now that you say the way you explained, possibly the 2 years makes sense. And being 48 years is a bit of a sigh of relief for me, and I'm just kidding. So between 48 and 50, there's no difference. Great, Monica. So just sort of sticking on this topic so that the people around get a full view of the financial plan, the multi-asset class investment, etc. Coming back to an early executive life, and almost 80% of the people here in the audience are millennials or sub 30 sort of audience. It's a bit of paradox, right? That in the first 10 to 15 years of a working executive's life, financial investments and even savings get subsumed big time when a person buys his or her first home. So most of the savings go into paying EMIs, which is the fact that every young person has gone through. So do you have any advice on buying this first home for self-use for young people out there, or anything around this area?
Right. No, it's a very, very important question, because the burden on those years, I call them the really tough years, because you've started a family, there are lifestyle goals, your income hasn't ballooned the way that it typically balloons in your 40s. I mean, there's usually this big jump in income in the 40s, and 50s is your peak earning period. But, the 30s is like the toughest time. There's growing families, young children, needs, all of that. Plus, there is this EMI which is going out. I think a very important thing is for young people to be fully committed to be living in the city in which they're buying their home. So I would say don't rush into buying your first home. Only if you're certain that you will continue to live in the city for the next at least 10 to 15 years, and you want, you're able to buy the home which ticks all the boxes of a good locality, near to school, maybe you can do the commute, whatever it is. The yields today on real estate is between 1.5–2%, depending on where you're buying. And the difference between an EMI and rent is so large. EMI is a multiplier of rent. I mean, for that rent, you can get a very different accommodation than what you would otherwise when you pay an EMI. So I would prudently take into account all of these things in terms of lifestyle issues and all of that, and then make a very considered decision when I want to buy the house. And pushing it a little bit should be all right, because you should really, because the rental that you will get will be a fraction of the EMI that you pay. Do you really want to put that burden onto yourself? And for people who actually do already have an EMI, now you need to think about it. It's already happening, or wherever it is, you've taken the decision, stay with it. I would think of it like that most of all of us are organized sector workers. So we have 24% of our basic going into PF, 12% I give, 12% employer gives. So, you can talk to yourself that, look, for my retirement, I'm already doing 24%. On top of that, there is the EMI. Plus, if I can just make my tax saving and a little more, I'm okay. So, don't get overwhelmed by this huge burden where you see these large retirement corpus numbers, and it is a big retirement number that you need, but possibly push it towards, little later, by which time your EMI remains the same, but your income hopefully grows, and maybe, the two spouses are able to work after the whole young child thing is over. So you get another boost to income. So you could then salt away far more for your retirement rather than stress an already stressed balance sheet of the month by trying to, try and save for that retirement. So that is how I would try and talk to myself if I was in that age group with a growing family and EMI, plus the desire to save for future.
Interesting, Monica. So the arbitrage of a 2.5% rent versus 7.5% home loan, which is the 5% gap that would be digging into your savings, is one piece that you're talking about. Of course, the work from home, stay from home sort of experience is throwing a new sort of a need for homes, Monica. And this, we are seeing it actually in real life. So the X% of people want to move from a 1.5 BHK to 2 BHK just because of elbow space, like the 3 people on Wi-Fi, the child, the wife, and the husband. So some of those sort of segment are coming out in the market to buy. But I think your advice is for the larger generation, larger sort of audience.
And COVID will get over. I mean, whether it's 1 year, whether it's 2 years, the memory will remain. But I mean, we will all see how quickly everybody gets back to getting out. So yes, we're in the middle. Yes, we need to be careful. But the minute the vaccine is out, we are back to shaking hands.
It's not a Russian one. So
yeah.
Monica, sort of changing gears again to one of my favorite topics this time, technology and digital. I'll talk about tech and finance, obviously. After almost a decade of the advent of fintech companies in India, we have not heard of many mass-scale disruption models emerging. Possibly Paytm, Zerodha are sort of representative companies. Some payment gateways have been pretty smart. Is it the regulations in India are too tough, which are sort of not letting any smaller fintech run away with the market? Yeah, picture abhi baki hai.
Picture तो regulator control कर रहा है. Because again, I'll come back to my first point. It took the government, the regulator, RBI, and the banks to build the backbone, to build the payments backbone. And we have a state-of-the-art payment system in India today. And then you will have all the apps which run on that. Which fintech? So the minute somebody sets up a fintech in the financial planning space, you will run up on the regulatory arbitrage. So you will need clearances from SEBI, IRDA, RBI, PFRDA. And some of the regulators will have rules which prevent you from doing anything else. So my sense is there is space. We need, of course, there is going to be huge growth. And we already see a lot of fintechs in the space. But I think if we can get the regulations in place, the big boom will happen. I mean, the space for a model like a Schwab in the US is all open here. I mean, why is it that a large, deep pocket investor in India has not put more money into this segment, which everybody says is going to grow? The financialization is happening. We are seeing more and more people coming in. But I think we are still running on, the 70s model of regulation, trying to fit it to a $3 trillion economy with very, very different aspirations and very different habits of money. So it's purely policy failure which is preventing this big boom which is waiting to happen in fintech. So very brave people are trying, and it's good, but it's in pockets rather than, this full large investment, full service, digital way to manage your money.
Easily, and you're right, Monica. I've heard of many completely online digital banks coming in the West already, and sort of we are sort of still nowhere close to that. And I'll keep on bringing parallels between the sector that I am in real estate and fintech. So this time, it's a perverse benefit that real estate is gaining because there's no strong regulations so far. So we have seen many technology companies. Right from the search and discovery to the visualization coming here. And of course, nowhere close to what the fintech should be doing. But that's a quick sort of glimpse for the audience on what's happening on this side. Moving on, Monica, and finishing the cusp of the real estate and finance sort of topics. There is a new kid on the block, a product called REIT, which was recently launched. So do you have any views on that as an investment class?
Right. So an average middle-class Indian is very positive towards real estate, but real estate, as we all know, has a lot of issues in India. I mean, for the longest time, why have we not had regulations? Because it's a sum for black money. This is where all the politicians' money goes to get dumped. This is where all the non-tax paid money comes to go to bed. So there is huge problems with the kind of practices that have been prevalent in real estate. And it is not a reflection on the sector, but it's a reflection on, again, policy and the way that they have allowed an industry to function. So I will always step back from blaming an industry. But I will say that here are profit-making entrepreneurs. How is it that you will incentivize them to do the right thing? That is where it fails, where real estate happens. So REITs is a part of that story. Mutual funds allow REITs, but it has been such a difficult thing to onboard good projects and to onboard investors into it. I just think that as we go more formal, as we reduce the impact of black money in real estate, as this industry gets more formalized, and it is beginning to happen. For instance, you are getting far more white-only deals in the market than ever before. The black component on the black deals has gone up because, you know, it's a tiger that you can't get off. Once you've got a black component in your real estate, then if you're selling, what do you do with the cash? So then you put it into more real estate. So what I understand is the cash component where black is being done has actually increased, but the number of white deals actually is going up. So it's a very old industry. It's a very old habit for real estate to be the way it is. As this formalization happens, I would imagine REITs would do extremely well, simply because as an investor, I'm talking of not this traditional Indian investor who's buying gold, FD, plot, but an asset allocator, equity, debt, gold, real estate. Now, if I do allocation in real estate today, I can't allocate anywhere. But if I want real estate to be, say, other than the house that I live in and own, I want another 20% allocation, for instance. Through a REIT, I can get this objective. So as we get REITs as an asset within, say, the mutual fund industry, I would see allocations beginning to come. But it's part of that whole policy process. It's a part of the regulatory process. It's part of the formalization story of India, that it will take time, but it will happen.
Correct. So green shoots and baby steps towards that. I think that's a sort of view. Monica, moving on, if I'm asked, where does Monica Hallan invest her family's investable surplus?
Yeah, right. It's a great question, and I'm very happy to answer that. So if anybody's read my book, that's exactly what I do, which is that the house that I live in is the only real estate I own. My entire savings are in mutual funds. I have an asset allocation, which I have to share with you that when you think that you know a lot, you make mistakes. So people like me make mistakes. So when the March event happened, I found myself fully 100% in equity. Right? So the learning for me was asset allocation works for everybody. Yeah. So without actually messing with my portfolio, my additional allocations are now towards debt. So I do exactly what I tell other people to do. So I slipped up on one because of overconfidence, but that asset allocation also, it's also age related. So as you get into your 50s, that recovery is so much more difficult of your earning capacity. So your prudence should really start when you hit that 50 number in your age. You know, that prudence in terms of your asset allocation must start. So asset allocation is not just words, it actually means something. And my investments are purely what I say in the book. The gold jewelry, I don't consider as investments. I don't have paintings, which I consider as investments. I don't do things like wine and all. I mean, that's all. I just don't agree that those are investments. Investments will be equity, debt, real estate. Gold is a fraction. Gold in terms of ETFs or government bonds will be between 5 to 10%, you know. So that asset allocation and financialization is really what I do. And in mutual funds, it's a mix of products between liquid, ultra short term, mid cap, small cap, multi cap, you know, so the large cap. So across the spectrum, and I keep my number of funds to about 8 to 10, depending on, you know, whether I need liquidity, so how much I'm in a liquid fund. So I don't allow portfolio spread to happen because then you're just buying the index. So I actually honestly do exactly what I'm telling other guys to do.
Excellent. And that's called walking the talk completely, or at least doing what you're writing. No, well done. And guys, I hope you caught on to that. Those are nuggets of wisdom. The asset allocation is a function of the life stage that you are in. That was one nugget which Monica gave. The spread between asset classes, which is equities, debt, real estate, gold, again, in terms of ETF, etc. Could be international equities, could be the fifth sort of asset class for people who have more wealth. The percentage allocation differs from age and lifestyle. So that's pretty important because Monica, if you remember, there was a paper which said that about 94% of returns come from just the asset allocation rather than choosing stocks or mutual funds.
Yes.
So I think that's what Monica was referring to. Monica, I've got a few interesting questions, so I'll just sort of hurry up my chat with one last sort of point, which is completely different from what we have discussed so far. I don't know if you're aware, but Anurag Group is on the forefront of practices for making the workplace a great place for women team members. And you yourself are one of the leading women luminaries in the personal finance and advisory world. Would you have any message for our budding women leaders, please?
The only message is that you are constrained by your own image about yourself. You have to learn to raise your hand up. And what really helps is a supportive home. And yes, there is discrimination. Yes, there are workplaces which are not very partial to women, but it's an ongoing struggle. And if you happen to be in a place where you can raise your hand up for more responsibility, you should absolutely do that. And it is also, your own desire to go to a leadership position which takes you there. So if you think you are alpha, if you think you really have the attributes to do it, to get to a leadership position, to raise your hand for the job, I mean, don't hold back. Just like go for it.
Excellent, Monica, and sort of the advice coming from a person who has done that. Like Sheryl Sandberg has said that in the future, there won't be women leaders, there'll be leaders. So stop talking about women leaders as a term. So thanks for sharing that. Nikita, I think we have 3-4 minutes, right, to pick up a couple of questions. I'm seeing interesting panel.
Yes, so we've got 3-4 questions coming.
Great. Cool. So Monica, I'll try to just quickly paraphrase these from the chat if it's fine.
Yeah.
It's open to everyone. I'm picking up one which says when the economy is slow and contracting, which is I think the current state, stock markets are recovering or shooting up. Economies world over will need some time to restart. The question actually is, do you think the stock market is just speculating currently or maybe creating another bubble?
I think it's a liquidity issue because, money doesn't disappear anywhere. It's all there. So the velocity of money reduces, but we've had actually people saving a lot of money. So there have been people who've been badly hit. And there are many, many Indias. I mean, we've got the audience that we have right now is really that, the top 10-15% of the population. Other than the people who lost jobs or saw reduced incomes, people have actually done a large number of savings because there was nowhere to spend last few months. You couldn't go out, you can't do holidays, you can't spend on eating out, clothes. So where has that money gone? It's gone into repairing debt. People have repaid debt, they have built fixed deposits, and some of the money has come into the stock market. The easy money policy globally also is giving the boost to the stock market. So whether it's a bubble or not, I don't think anybody can tell. Yes, valuations look overblown, but they've been overblown for a long time. And will growth come back? My personal opinion is it has no option but to come back. It's a matter of time. When you have this push into the middle class from below, the consumption story is all there. We are seeing structural reform happening, whether we are going kicking and screaming. Look at the farm bill story. Everyone's going kicking and screaming. I mean, we've been saying for decades, we want reform, agri reform chahiye. The day it happens, people are hair pulling and chest beating, so reform is happening. All of this begins to show up in investments and growth. So the story is there. volatility is something we need to get used to. And again, if your asset allocation is right, you can ride that volatility out. But is the market wrong? I don't have enough knowledge to answer that question, because the market has its own. What I can tell you is over the long term, if you're looking at a 7-year horizon, we are fine.
Excellent. That's pretty reassuring, Monica. And this is the sort of a solid foundation that we have built over the last sort of a few decades, which will help us possibly in a almost a foundation-linked growth in the equity market, which you're saying, rather than just looking at next year's P multiple and getting worried that hey, it's crossed T. Brilliant. Couple of questions on financial planning and on products. So Amit Thakur is asking that what's your take on the people who want 100% guaranteed investment other than FD, as people older than 50 don't have any knowledge? I think he's looking at some sort of a FD type of product, but not FD.
So your products are the government safety products. You have the PPF, there's the National Savings Certificate, you have the government bonds, which are taxable bonds. Life insurance companies have some guaranteed plans. They were doing about 5.5%. So if you plan to stay with the plan for its lifetime and you don't mind the price of that guarantee, then those are things you can look at. I typically will never offer a life insurance plan for investment, but if you are guarantee seeking and there is a plan which is giving you a 100% guarantee on the return and you know the return number and you're happy with it, there is no problem in going in for that life insurance policy. So my problem with life insurance has been the miscommunication about the return. But for a guaranteed return seeker, these are the options out there.
And guys, if you got Monica's point on the mis-selling of insurance, she's almost a PhD in that, though not literally. The Journal of Economics paper that I spoke about actually has been written on that topic itself. That's a 1-hour talk at some other time. Moving on, there are a few very specific questions, guys, and there's a question Amit Thakur again you asked on the 25-year-old asset planning. Please read the book. I think that really builds it up. So I'll just move on to some other people. Our chief evangelist for culture, Gagan Singh, thanks you, Monica, for the steps that you mentioned for women leaders. So that's just a comment. And thanks for that. Last one, possibly, Sumant has asked is that, does compounding really happen in mutual funds? If yes, how? Or is it just a way how it's measured?
Okay. Compounding, you don't get compounding in stocks, right? So you get compounding in a guaranteed return product, like a fixed deposit. The PPF will compound. The stock market gives you no compounding. So if the markets fall, you lose the value. Suppose the Sensex is falling from 38,000 to 20,000. It isn't as if the gains that you had got locked in. Your return journey will begin from 20,000 back up again. So stock market doesn't compound. It's a miscommunication that your money will grow, but it's not going to compound in the way that we understand compounding as in a fixed income product. The stock market through an index over the long term gives you the return on equity, which today is around 13-14% CAGR, but it is not due to compounding. That's the growth which you see over time, which is linked to the stock prices.
I hope you got that, Sumant. I think it's two different things. Compounding normally refers to the debt component, which is the fixed sort of return. Great. There are a couple of very specific questions. I'm going to pick it up, and we are in touch with Monica on email. We'll sort of share with her because they're very specific to arbitrage funds and liquid gift funds. So for the sake of the larger audience, we may not really go there. Monica, I think we have covered the questions. We have covered some of our topics that we thought that we should be talking about this. Any other sort of closing remarks from your side? And then we can sort of...
No, Bas, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to different people on the subject that I am so passionate about. And for people who want to know more, definitely pick up Let's Talk Money, not because, I have written it, but just the feedback that I'm getting. that it's a very easy onboarding onto your financial control of your life. So it's not going to make you rich overnight. It'll build stability in your life. So I'm ending with a pitch for my own book.
Oh, excellent. And in fact, I loved your Hindi title. It was really पैसे के बाद अपने मेहनत की कमाई को और मेहनत करवाएं. So something like that.
Right.
It sort of makes it that make your money work harder. For that you have worked so hard for. That's a brilliant sort of speak for that. So with that, great. Thanks a lot, Monica, for taking on the time from your busy schedule. And thank you for attending. I hope we added some value to you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.